أسعد الله مساءكم بكل خير. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Maurice Pomerantz. I'm the executive director of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. I'm also a professor here of Arabic literature. Before we get on with tonight's lecture, I'd like to tell you about some of our upcoming events happening here in A6. And I'd like to silence my phone. I encourage you to do the same. On Monday, February 17th, 2025, we have a marvelous speaker, personal friend, one of the great scholars and critics of our time, Dr. Werner Sollers. He is the Henry B. and Anne M. Cabot Professor of English and American Studies Emeritus at Harvard University, and he was, for many years, a global professor of literature here at New York University, Abu Dhabi. He'll be speaking about in a lecture conversation, I think, entitled Cosmopolitan Imagination, Cultural Reflections from the 21st Century. The discussion is in celebration of the publication of his works as a reader. I think it's a really special opportunity to listen to someone reflect on a remarkable career, which really has touched on some of the fundamental issues of our day. What does it mean to be a citizen of the world? How do literature, culture, and identity shape our understanding of belonging and difference? Really big issues, so I encourage you to come out for that. On Wednesday, February 19th, that's next week, Frank Courchon, Director of Research at the French National Center for Scientific Research, will be giving a talk entitled Biological Invasions, the Forgotten Threat, and that's at 6 p.m., as part of the Genome Systems Conference here at NYU Abu Dhabi. The talk will explore the significant yet often overlooked threat of biological invasions and approaches it from a variety of different angles, so do check that out. You can register for these talks online, and please do follow us on social media. We're very lively throughout most of the rest of this month in February, leading into Ramadan. Now it is my distinct pleasure to hand the floor over to my colleague and friend, the eminent professor of social research and public policy here at NYU Abu Dhabi, Dr. Georgi Derlugian. Dr. Derlugian is an eminent scholar whose interests in global history reach back through a long career. Having received his PhD Kandidat Nauk in Moscow in global history in 1980, Dr. Derlugian then studied at the famed Ferdinand Brodel Center for the Study of Economies in Binghamton, New York, where he received a second doctorate. His books, too, chart an itinerary of interest rarely found in faculties, let alone in one person. World history, African history, Caucasian history, the future of capitalism, the fate of the former Soviet republics, and the links between Paleolithic chieftains and the heads of global corporations. It is always my pleasure to see him here in our talks. He's often an audience member, but even more of a pleasure to hand the floor to him to introduce tonight's esteemed guest. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Didn't expect I was supposed to introduce, to thank you for the pleasure, because I stood here, and it is an honor. And I do remember distinctly how I had to introduce, say, Stephen Kotkin and his talk on Stalin. I introduced Adam Tooze and his talk on world disasters, which was, by the way, 13th of February 2020, so the pandemic would close us in 4 weeks after his talk. It's the last travel, by Adam Tooze, organized by NYUAD. Thank you so much, for bringing those speakers. And today, Jack Goldstone is kind of living legend in social science for a very good reason. You probably realize, that I teach too many undergraduates. I leave nothing for granted. So I ask them the question, when was England ever a republic? And who was the president of England at the time? They probably heard some echoes of Oliver Cromwell. The word president did not exist in English language yet. He was called Lord Protector, and the Republic was called Commonwealth. Literal translation, res publica. That's why it is still Commonwealth of Maryland, where our guest comes from. And there are different explanations for what happened in 1640s in England, and especially to the unfortunate King Charles I in that line of kings. And Jack came up with a very novel explanation, actually. You know, it was not class struggle. It was not rebellion by the common people. It was not, you know, correct me how wrong I am, you know, it was not about Protestant religion. It was about lords in the lordly families accumulating too many sons, you know, having too many children. And think about it, when crusades have already ended and British Empire has not yet arrived, colonies are not yet there. So what do they do after 2 or 3 generations of breeding, like in the times of Shakespeare, and surviving? You know, getting at each other's throat. You know, so this is the origin of what I explain as political demography. So this is quite an ominous topic. It may sound very technical to some. It may sound abstract to others, but this is actually all about youth bulges you have been hearing lately. Here is the man who introduced much of that notion. You heard about the Tahrir Square and the students there and how it all ended. So I'm looking forward to listening to, well, doom and gloom, and if there is any sign. Besides that, let me just mention that Professor Goldstone just came from Washington, D.C., which is this epicenter now. We cannot call it center. It's epicenter, like in an earthquake of global. Yeah, we shall see, you know, whether it will be the suicide of capitalist world system or what, you know. So we welcome your questions, but please remember, you know, that there is a long presentation, I know, and we will have to end on time. So there will be a timer. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Georgi, and thank you, Maurice. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the beautiful new campus of NYU Abu Dhabi. Last time I was here, this was still a construction zone, and it's really evolving beautifully. Thank you all for joining us on a really lovely day outside. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm not really going to talk about doom and gloom. I know that's disappointing. I've spent much of my career studying social processes that shape the past, but I'm now trying to understand the future, which is a relief since the present is hard to keep up with. Perhaps we'll get to that later. But what I want to talk about today in my presentation is to welcome everybody to what will be really a new world. We're entering a new era for humanity, an era in which population growth is slowing down and will soon end. And this is a momentous turning point. Humanity has known only some growth for the most part. Now, growth was very slow until about 250 years ago, but for the last 250 years, the world as we know it has been shaped by rapid population growth. That is now coming to an end. Now, good news, I said I was going to be optimistic. People are living longer and healthier lives. It's remarkable, but life expectancy at birth has very nearly doubled in just the last 75 years. Now, will it continue? There are pessimists who say we've gotten to the end, biological aging can only be extended so far, but there are optimists who say we've already, in the laboratory, successfully reversed signs of aging in mice. And it's just a matter of going that much further to tinkering with our genomes and being able to perhaps regenerate cells and reverse aging in humans. And so the optimists are saying humanity will probably have a normal life expectancy of 100 before the end of this century. It doesn't matter whether you think the life expectancy, which is now in the low 80s. Will it get up into the high 80s and stop? Will it keep going to the hundreds? Compared to where humanity was for almost all of our existence, when life expectancy was in 4 decades, this is great news. We are all living longer, and you can probably expect your children to live substantially longer lives than you. Now, speaking of children, at the same time that we're living longer, modern science has given families, and particularly women, much greater control over the number of children they have. This, of course, was accelerated by work on hormones and the pill arriving in the 1960s. I'm going to grab my water. Sorry for the interruption. And the result of this has been to build on what has been a continual decline in fertility starting in Europe about the time of the French Revolution and has now spread throughout the world. As you can see, the number of children born has fallen from an average of about 5 to 6 for most families around the world. That was true even in Europe and North America, beginning of the century. Now, globally, we're down very near to replacement and are falling below replacement fertility globally. In fact, about 70% of the global population today lives in countries with fertility at replacement or below. Replacement means every woman having about 2 or 2.1 children on average. That is, every couple having 2 children. That essentially replaces this generation with the next generation the same size. But once you get fertility falling below 2, you end up depressing the rate of population growth. Eventually it turns negative. And that curve on the right, total population, it stops rising. And we expect global population to level out around 10 billion, give or take, and then start to decline once we get into the next century. Now, there's a debate going on in the world. It seems inevitable that this will happen. Fertility has fallen everywhere. It is not rising anywhere, and so this is the trend that we have. Is it good? Well, fewer people does seem to mean less pollution, more land for each of us, maybe more food for each of us, less strain on the planet. Jorgi mentioned I'd done work on the youth bulge. It's true. Societies with large numbers of young people are more prone to ideological extreme movements and political violence. So as the world gets more mature, we can expect less political violence and less extremism. Fewer children means less burden on women who spend fewer years engaged in childbearing and childcare, and more opportunities for them to have careers and be empowered. And this is something that women have taken advantage of quite strongly, even aggressively, particularly in the West, but increasingly across the entire world. And one hopes with population growth slowing, there'll be less competition for jobs and housing, something that people are very sensitive to today, when globally there's a shortage of housing in much of the West, from Europe, Australia, North America, and competition among young people for jobs has been fierce. So there's a lot of hope that having fewer people in the world will make lives better. The problem is, this is a process that once you begin, it's not easy to stabilize or turn it around. Fertility has been falling not just below replacement, but way below replacement. So fertility is now 1.3 children per woman or less in many Asian countries. So that means for every woman and their mate, 1.3, not 2 children, 1.3. In Europe, it's almost 1.4 across the board, between 1.5, 1.4, 1.6. The United States is down to 1.6 children per woman. It's been falling for the last 20 years. And in China, fertility is now at 1 child per couple. There was a time when China had a one-child policy. They've been gradually moving in that direction. One of the ironies is they've now achieved a one-child reality voluntarily, even though the government is trying to backpedal and encourage people to go back to having more children. But Chinese women are not in agreement with this. Fertility is 1.0. In South Korea, fertility is less than 1. In fact, well less than 1. So it's about 0.72 in the last reading for 2024. In both China and Korea, there was a lot of hope that last year, being the year of the dragon in the Chinese lunar calendar, which is a lucky year for births, there was a big hope that, oh good, now we're going to see the reversal because, yeah, fertility has been falling, but that's just because people are waiting. They really want to have their children in the year of the dragon, so we're going to see a big bounce in recovery. There was a 1% increase in births in South Korea and China last year. Very disappointing, and unfortunately it looks like they're back on the track for lower fertility. South Korea is not alone. Fertility is about 0.5 in Shanghai, 0.8 in Hong Kong, 0.9 in Macau, 0.9 in Singapore. So having fertility below 1 child per couple is a reality for hundreds of millions of people. Now, fertility has been falling. It seems to keep falling, and that's because this trend has a lot of momentum to it. Once builders realize that most people are going to have 1 or 2 kids at most, they stop building larger flats and larger homes. There's no market for them. But once the housing market is producing only smaller homes and larger homes become rarer and more expensive, that discourages the next generation from having large families as well. Cultural expectations. What is considered good, normal, desirable? How much should you sacrifice for your children and how many? That becomes a kind of social norm. People are deeply influenced by what they see as the expected lifestyle. So even in countries that we might think, oh, a country that's low income and is historically high fertility, like India, India also is now below replacement fertility in almost all provinces except the more rural Northwest. It's really as if the entire world has decided we're going to shift from a world in which we have large families to where the norm is women working, women spending fewer years in childbirth and childcare, and we're going to what I call a 0-1-2 world. That is, a lot of women choose not to have children, many choose to have 1, and some choose to have 2. And that 0-1-2 world locks in below replacement fertility, because if some people have none, for every woman who has no children, someone has to have 2 in order to even get an average of 1. In order to bring the average up to 2 children per family, you need to have a large number of people having 3 or more to offset those that have 0 or 1. And that's just not happening. Yes, there are people who have 3, 4, 5 children, but they tend to be religious minorities, Amish, Mormons, Orthodox Jews. For the most part, everywhere else in the world, Muslims, Christians, Hindus have reduced their fertility to striking levels. Now, what does that mean? At a fertility level of 1.0, 1 child per woman on average in the population falls by 85% in a century. Now, that seems like a very large number. It seems absurd because, we're not seeing that happen now, right? Well, it doesn't happen immediately because if you have a large population and each family has 1 child each, as long as the parents are still around, you don't get that sense of the population having shrunk. But once the parents start to age and pass away, you're left with a next generation that's only half the size of the one that preceded it. And if each generation is about 30, 40 years, a half and a half and a half, over 100 years, fertility of 1.0 leads to enormous population decline. Over 2 centuries, you're practically wiped out. This is why the government of Korea, South Korea, where fertility is well below 1, has declared a national population emergency. I mean, it sounds absurd. They still have odd million people, and it's a thriving economy, but they've seen the future, and the present dictates a future of far, far fewer Koreans. So even China, which 1.4 billion people today, the result is the population is aging fast, but children are not filling in the gaps. So by 2100, if it keeps its current fertility levels, which seem plausible, doesn't seem to be changing at all, but if that remains for another 70 years, China will have 285 million people over age 65, as against 36 million under age 20. That is, the number of people over 65 will be 6-7 times as large as the number of children. Now that's kind of a strange science fiction landscape. You have to imagine yourself walking around in a society where virtually everyone you meet is over 65 and children are extremely scarce. And so I joke that 500 years from now, if this is how things start, there will not be any human beings on Earth. We'll have our progeny, but they'll all be mechanical, and they'll say, oh yes, there were people here, but they stopped reproducing, and so they died out, and we are all who's left. Now that's, again, apocryphal and science fiction, but it is literally where we are headed simply by maintaining the fertility levels that are widespread today. Now, that may sound too extreme. You don't have to follow me 100 years into the future. It's serious enough that in just 25 years, because of extended life expectancy and falling fertility, we will see some societies right here, Japan, Italy, Germany, Spain, South Korea, in which the number of people over 65 and over 80 is already large compared to the population under age 20. That is, in just 25 years, all of these societies are looking at a situation in which they will have roughly the same number of people over 80 as under 20. And the 65 and up population will be 2 to 3 times as large as the children. Roughly 1 out of every 3 people will be 65 or older. Humanity has never seen societies structured like this. It's never happened in human history, so it is a new era. We'll see if we're prepared for what that's going to mean. The USA looks exceptional here. Relatively few people that are older, more people that are younger. But that is entirely dependent on the United States maintaining its history of strong rates of immigration of young workers. Now, we had a huge surge in immigration the last 2 years. Immigration in 22, 23 was double historic levels, about 2 million a year. And that's partly because of change of policy, partly because of crises elsewhere in the world, partly kind of a pent-up post-COVID surge. But all of these things together led to a big increase in migration, and we now seem determined to pull back from that. There's anxiety, backlash, that we had too much immigration. Now we're going to shift down a bit. But if we lose our immigration altogether, then the US will kind of slide into the pattern of these other countries. Now, low fertility states are going to have problems paying for health care and pensions for seniors with fewer taxpayers. That's simple arithmetic. The United States Social Security and Medicare health funds are both expected to run out of the ability to pay their current benefit level by 2033. Now, that seems like years away. We have a lot of years to catch up on that. But 7 years is not far. It's coming soon, 7, 8 years. And the projection at present is that the United States will have to reduce benefits for Social Security and Medicare by anywhere from 10 to 25% unless it raises taxation sometime in the next 8 years. Now, nobody likes having taxes raised. So the prospects for taxation going up are pretty low. In fact, our incoming administration is talking about a very large tax cut at a time when we already have very large national debts. Other countries are facing the same problem. European countries have large debts. Japan, which is kind of in the vanguard of global aging, has responded to its aging population by running up its national debt to over 200% of GDP, largest in the developed world. Now, that was feasible when Japan was facing national interest rates that were negative or well below 0.5%. But now, as global interest rates go up, the Japanese are very concerned about how they'll be able to keep paying their already outstanding debts. Meanwhile, the US and Europe, even Latin America, are all concerned about how do we pay more for this rapidly aging population with fewer young taxpayers without increasing debt levels that are already very high. So there's a fiscal problem. Unfortunately, there's also a productivity problem. Now, artificial intelligence may swoop in and may save us all. That is, if each one of us becomes 5 times more productive because we somehow can utilize artificial intelligence to do so, that would be great. I don't see that happening. There are a lot of optimists who say that artificial intelligence will be a great all-purpose tool. So far, the large language models are most effective at creating artificial companions for young people. So you may have seen or heard, my daughter does this too, you spend time online and you end up consulting the chatbots for advice in your life. And the nice thing about artificial intelligence companions is they tend to be non-judgmental, they're anxious to please, they try and generally put a positive spin on everything, give you positive feedback, boost your self-esteem. It's really great. But again, people don't have children yet that I can figure out with an AI companion. So if we shift more and more of our social relations to engaging with artificial intelligence, that may push fertility down even further. That doesn't solve the problem. And as far as AI making our workforce more productive, the workforce is frankly going to be much older. And we don't know if people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s will adapt as well to using AI to become more productive in what they do. And we don't know who is going to be enhanced by AI. Is it going to be people who do kind of routine cognitive work? Will they be replaced by AI? And if they do, who will make up for their tax contribution to the fiscal picture? Will construction workers and landscapers be replaced by robots directed by AI? It's possible, but so far the costs don't look favorable. So this is kind of an unknown. If you have a very optimistic picture of the future, you can say we will be rescued by artificial intelligence. But realistically, what we know so far is if you have an older labor force and a smaller labor force, productivity tends to go down because productivity is generally raised by bringing in more young workers who have the latest education and who join the workforce and can look forward to 20 or 30 years of increasing experience and skill. People who are in their 40s tend to reach their peak in productivity. Now, it's higher generally for a 40-year-old experienced worker than for a 20-year-old, but the 20-year-old generally increases their productivity over time, whereas the 40-year-old tends to plateau. And we're going to have more and more of our workforce all around the developed world in those older cohorts. Unfortunately, there will also be generational conflict over how much are we going to continue to invest in seniors who have a very nice package in most of the European, Latin American countries, not so much in Asia. East Asian pensions are far from generous at this point. But young people will say, what about us? What about our jobs, our housing, our needs? There's only so much to go around. If you have a growing pie, if the economy is growing at 3, 4, 5% a year, it's much easier to paste over and manage any of these conflicts between older, younger groups. But if the economy is slowing down, and whether you look at China or Europe or the United States, economic growth has been far less than it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so with a slower growing pie, you're going to get more competition for what remains. Finally, even with artificial intelligence, even with driverless cars, we can expect labor shortages in the labor-intensive domains of construction, landscaping, and particularly healthcare, nursing, senior home care, other areas of medicine. It's very hard to replace the human touch. You can have skilled radiological diagnoses by artificial intelligence. The algorithms are pretty good at recognizing illnesses. Same things. Hopefully, AI will make better sense out of our medical records, which are fragmented and difficult to keep and often inefficient. But in terms of actually taking care of people, it's important to have human hands and faces at the interface with the patients, and that is something we still need to have. And again, it's going to be a problem if the numbers of young people going into these fields goes down 20, 30, 40% each generation. And there are even concerns about military manpower. Yes, the battlefield is changing. Drones and missiles are taking over. But what we've seen in the Ukraine is you still need human troops to defend territory, to take territory on the battlefield. You can certainly attack tanks with drones, but you still need human infantry to take the roads, junctions, and cities that are what people are essentially fighting for. It's hard to imagine a military that is wholly automated fighting against a military who is wholly automated, unless people are content to simply sit in their bunkers and not really exchange any territory, and then you say, what are people fighting for? But the fighting that we have seen in just the last few years, whether it's been in Gaza, whether it's been in Ukraine, whether it's been in Ethiopia, has been very much fighting in which young soldiers play a critical role, and the number of young people that you can recruit is going to decline. It's not just that there are fewer young people, that's true, but when you have fewer young people, the demand for those young people in the private sector is very strong, their wages go up, it's much more difficult to recruit them into military service when competition for jobs in the private sector leads to higher salaries there. So US military, European militaries have already had trouble meeting their recruitment quotas, and that too will get worse. Now, immigration is kind of the great obvious solution. If you don't have enough young people, bring them in. And this is something that some countries have done very well. Australia, the Gulf countries, Switzerland have very high rates of foreign-born population, much higher than the United States. Canada has almost twice as many foreign-born as a percentage of its population as the USA. Nonetheless, politically around the world, there is now a backlash against immigration. People feel it has gone too far. I don't know actually what too far means because it's subjective. When people feel uncomfortable with immigration, they vote for politicians who promise to reduce it. What makes people feel uncomfortable? A number of things. Surges of immigration rather than a gradual, steady flow. Immigration from parts of the world that are somewhat unfamiliar, where you don't have already large populations that have been assimilated. And both of those things have been happening now. That is, in response to war and conflict, we had surges of immigration from Syria, Ukraine, Ethiopia. And in general, there is more immigration from Asia and Africa to Europe and America than they had been used to previously. So both of these factors are causing political conflict over immigration and working against it. Now, there's a kind of geopolitical struggle in the world. You can't paper it over anymore. We had hoped that the wonderful global governance institutions that were created at the end of World War II would continue to grow and absorb emerging nations, and that the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the International Criminal Court, all of these would bind the nations of the world together in a peaceful, productive, global trading world in which goods and people and capital flowed across borders, enriching everyone. Now, that turned out to be hopelessly optimistic, because I think, as most economists probably would have told you if they were being honest, if there are global flows of capital, people, and goods, some people are going to get richer and others will not. It's usually the case that opportunities for profit allow some people to profit greatly, others not so much. And that's kind of the creative destruction of capitalism, and that's been the story. So the reality of the last 30 years has been, yes, great prosperity was created, but it was mainly for the Chinese and Indian middle classes where people were lifted out of poverty, and for the global financial, professional, and cognitive elites who were able to benefit from the increasingly global production and distribution of resources and the shift of value added into fields like finance and creative arts out of manufacturing and agriculture, which became more commoditized and globalized. So there's a backlash against globalization in the West, understandable. And there's a feeling in China that this is the time for China to rise, that the West has kind of played its cards badly, that capitalism and constitutional democracy have led to polarization, paralysis, political breakdown. And so China, with its unified, harmonious system that promotes unity and has a clear centralized vision, China is going to rise. It's going to reverse the trend of the last 200 years where China was humiliated by opium wars, colonialism, economic decline. The Chinese like to think that that century of humiliation is now over, and they are going to reclaim their normal and proper place as the leading country in all of Eurasia and perhaps the world. Now, their story has been, look at what happened in 2007-8. There was a huge economic crisis in the West. We in China were barely touched. During the COVID pandemic, there was panic and paralysis. We managed to contain the virus we contained the fatalities of the virus in China to a very low level. Yes, we had to lock things down, but precisely because we had the strong centralized authority to do so, we managed this crisis better. So in both the global economic crisis and the global pandemic crisis, the Chinese government claims that they have demonstrated that their system works better. And they intend to use that example to sell their system to the world with the assumption that this is going to be China's century and the United States is going to fade. Well, demographically, that doesn't seem to be the case. That is, the population in China is not acting optimistic. Young people are certainly not acting like it's their century. Instead, they are choosing not to get married or to get married later and have fewer children. So what does that story look like? For 40 years, China was the motor of the global economy. Chinese economic growth alone added $14 trillion in US dollars to the global economy. That was 1/4 of all economic growth in those 40 years. However, from now until 2060, China can expect the 0 to 17 age group to decline by 2/3. The prime working class, the prime working age population, those from 18 to 64, that will decline by almost 40%. And what's striking about these numbers is when I say between now and 2060, that population will decline, even if Chinese fertility were somehow miraculously to increase tomorrow, those kids would not enter the workforce for another 20 to 25 years. So between now and 2050, the future is pretty much baked in for China. Maybe things will get a little bit better for them if they can turn it around afterwards, but if not, they're looking at huge declines in their workforce and an equally huge decline, 100% increase in the population over 65. So by 2060, on today's trends, almost 40% of China's population will be 65 and over. It's hard to imagine China being a world-leading economy and a dominant world power when almost 40% of its population is 65 and older. But that's what they're facing, and that's why they're in such a panic to try and revive fertility, so far without success. Now, some people have recognized this, and they say, well, okay, if China is fading, then the future belongs to India, because India's population is forecast to continue to grow. It's going to go from 1.4 billion to 1.7 billion by 2060. So while China's population is fading away, India's population is going to grow. Surely the future belongs to India. Well, again, not so fast. From 2000 to 2020, India's annual GDP rose only slightly compared to China. Yes, they started to exhibit stronger growth, but the total increase was 1.7 trillion US dollars. Even if they grow 6% a year up to 2040, that economy will still only be about $5 trillion larger. That's about 5% of GDP. So plausible growth starting from the very small base relative to today. That is, today China's economy is almost 10 times larger than that of India. So even if India starts to catch up, it's not going to be the same motor that China was. But the real key to understanding India's future is to look at what's happening to population growth. Yes, India's population is going to continue to grow, but almost all of that growth is due to increases in life expectancy rather than more children. And that's a bit of a shock, because we're used to thinking of India as a place where people have large numbers of children. That was fixed in our minds during the 1960s and 70s, and talk of the new population bomb, and India's having 5, 6 children per woman. Even if we bring that down, it's still going to be No. India's population growth rate has been falling now for 30 years. Fertility has been falling. Births peaked about 2005. They've been falling for 20 years. And so most of the growth in India's population is going to be from large numbers of people living longer. In fact, the age 0 to 17 population is going to fall by about a quarter between now and 2060, almost as much as in China. The working age population will be pretty much stable. That is a little bit of growth, about 14% in the 18 to 64 population. So India is a good candidate to continue economic growth, even as China falters. But it's not going to be rapid growth. It's going to be pretty marginal, especially since the prime age workers, 1849, the most productive, the youngest, the best potential, that group is actually already peaked and is starting to decline. The age 65 group, however, is set for huge growth, 200% plus. And in fact, of all the population growth in India projected between now and 2060, 87% of that net growth is in people 65 and older. And almost all of the increase in the working age, that is 18 to 64 group, is going to be in the 45 to 65 group. Again, what you need to remember at India, population is going to grow, but it's mostly because people are living longer. Births started to decline 20 years ago, and net fertility in India today is now below replacement. Now, one ground for continued optimism is there are still parts of the world that have a lot of young people and where population is growing. So extinction is not immediately around the corner. We have a few decades before all of the world falls into population decline. And in particular, Africa's population is expected to grow very rapidly till about 2080 before it levels off. Even more importantly, if you look at the curve on the right, that lower blue curve, the median age of Africa is expected to remain rather low throughout the entire century. That is, Africa not only has a growing population, but unlike India, Africa's population is growing because they're still having lots of children. And that keeps the average age in the 20s, rather than, you look at East Asia, the median age will actually be in the 60s before the century is over. So the only place in the world where you're really going to have a lot of young people is Africa. Now, I'm speaking to you here in Abu Dhabi, and so I want to say something about population growth trends in this neighborhood. And there's actually good news there. That is to say, if you look at the countries in the Middle East, they fall into kind of roughly 3 baskets. There are countries that are dynamic. That is, they're expected to have about 40 to 50% population increase between now and 2050. That's a good, strong number. It suggests strong economic growth, great opportunities for increased productivity. Fertility tends to be low. So if you believe the figures, and I'm not sure these are really accurate, these are UN reported figures, and some countries are more accurate than others, not certain, but the projection for the United Arab Emirates is that fertility has already fallen to very low levels, comparable to East Asia. If that's true, the number of Emirati citizens will be falling, and therefore the growth will continue to be mostly from temporary migrants, increasing their numbers. That may or may not be a concern. From the economic point of view, if you can keep drawing on young people from other places to fill out your labor force, that may be okay, but if you want your citizenry to continue to grow, fertility needs to come back up to replacement or above. And in the UAE and Qatar, it may be below. But in Oman, Saudi Arabia, Syria, fertility is high. In Iraq and Pakistan, it's even still quite high, over 3. And so these countries will continue to have reservoirs of young people for a while longer. Now, there are 3 countries that are very young. That is to say, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia have fertility well over 4 children per family. They have an average age, median age, under 25. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Maybe too much youth is not great because, as we know, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia are politically deeply divided and have spent decades in serious violent conflict. And that appears to be something that goes along with very young populations. That is, if you have a very young population, it's harder to keep employment, housing, opportunities, social mobility up. That leads to discontented youth who are more prone to ideologically extreme mobilization and political conflict, and that has been the pattern in Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. Whether that pattern will continue depends, at least in part, on whether fertility goes down in those countries and they acquire a more mature age distribution, or whether they remain in a very high fertility, very young population state. Conversely, Iran and Turkey are now fairly old. That is, fertility has fallen well below replacement in these countries, and their expected population growth in the next 25 years is minimal. 11% for Iran, 4% for Turkey, and their median age will be in the low 40s. So this is going to create a kind of opportunity, but also asymmetries. That is, there will be some countries that are poised for a healthy level of growth, some countries that are going to be struggling with a very young population, and some that are struggling to adjust to a more older, rapidly aging population. Now, I mentioned Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. Aside from those states, most of the countries of Africa also have high fertility, in the same range of 3.5, 4.5, or more children per family. Now, ultra-young states have their own problems. It's not the same as aging states, but they're serious. Younger states are challenged in providing education and jobs to ever larger youth cohorts. If those youth cohorts don't get education and jobs, they become less productive. Political violence and conflict is always a risk. Radical and extremist movements tend to flourish in younger societies, and younger societies tend to produce outflows of migrants. Now, that may be valuable. Aging societies should see that as an opportunity, but it can also be seen as a threat. Now, we have this asymmetry in the world then. We have a large number of countries from East Asia to Europe to North America where populations are aging. They would like to raise their fertility if they could, and they are trying. Countries like Hungary spending 5% of GDP trying to raise fertility by offering various bribes and incentives to families to have kids. Hasn't worked. Fertility in Hungary is about 1.5. In fact, no one has found anything that works. This is kind of one of the distressing findings of social science and demography for the last 20 years. Countries across Europe and Asia have tried mortgages, housing, providing free daycare, long parental leaves, everything they think will make it easier for women to have children, and nothing has worked. Cash payments are the most helpful. That is, you get a little bit of increase of fertility if you offer people a lot of money if they have second or third kids. But the evidence also tends to show the people who take advantage of that are the people who would have had second or third kids anyway, and they do it a little faster to take advantage of the payment. But it turns out if you look over a 20-year period, you're not really raising the number of total children with these payments. So the measures to help working women are good. You know, free daycare, extended parental leave, protecting jobs so that you don't lose your job if you leave the workforce. Those are good things, but they're good mainly because they keep women in the workforce. They really don't produce significantly higher fertility. Now, when you ask why are women not having children and what can we do to change that? Economists have tended to dominate that conversation. An economist's answer is there must be incentives, there must be economic reasons that we can leverage to get women to have more kids. But no, that has not worked. So you start to bring in the demographers, the sociologists, and the anthropologists, and they say, it's really not just a matter of whether women choose to have kids. Let's take it a step back further. Usually, childbearing is preceded by marriage, and women are not getting married either. So the rate of marriage and the age of first marriage are both moving in directions that lead to fewer children. Fewer women are getting married. They tend to get married in their late 20s, sometimes in China in their early 30s, and by then they have one child at most maybe before they decide, okay, you know, time to move on. Now, women who get married in their 20s tend to be ideal for having 2 or 3 kids, but nobody's doing that anymore. So the problems really begin with marriage and relationships. Not just can you get married women to have more kids. Can you get them to think more positively about families? More young people are living at home, they're dating less, they're spending more time online. And so what seems to work for having larger families is religion, but even that not everywhere. That is, even in India, Indonesia, and Iran, which are fairly religious societies, you have very low fertility. So we don't know yet what can solve this problem. I tend to say that relations between men and women have to be at the core of understanding this. Now, for a second, let's move to solutions for ultra-young societies. There we actually do know what works to reduce fertility in societies where women are having 3, 4, or 5 children. And that is, we know that supplying contraception by itself doesn't work. Simply making contraception more available is nice, but doesn't seem to incentivize people if they still want to have large families. Urbanization and economic development do lead to lower fertility, but only slightly, and not very much in sub-Saharan Africa at all. That is, sub-Saharan Africa has seen very little reduction in fertility for the rate of urbanization and income growth compared to Latin America or South Asia. So what we do seem to think works is educating women, and not just primary education. If you have women in school until age 12, it doesn't help. They still get married at age 14 or 15. They don't have skills to go into the labor force. What really matters is keeping women in education until at least age 16, and even better, 18. So low secondary or completing secondary school helps. And as I mentioned, exposure to a global culture of smaller families in order to gain upward mobility. If women start to believe that there are benefits to themselves and their families from having fewer children, which is kind of what the message from the rest of the world is, they start to model that and adapt. That's why in most of India, fertility is already so low. It's because everybody is tapped into this global culture of upward aspirations. Now, you still need a context for empowering women. You can't just give them education and contraceptives and say, okay, I know you want I know you want smaller families now, because women are expected to produce children as their contribution to the greater extended family, particularly in Africa, where extended families are still powerful. So what makes it possible for women to choose to have fewer children and get supported in that choice by their extended family and their husbands is for women to be able to make an economic contribution on their own. And that means there has to be formal jobs, stable government, so that women can contribute to their families, and you don't need to rely so much on extended kin networks simply for survival and insurance. So as societies become more stable, better governed, and women have more opportunities to work, fertility goes down. And once fertility drops under 4, it seems to continue and accelerate. That is, once people experiment with what it's like to have smaller families and find that it's beneficial for them, it continues. So in a sense, women become the key to the future in both high fertility and low fertility societies. Making women's lives better seems to be crucial. In low fertility countries, women actually say they'd like to have more children. So if you poll people in Europe or the US, certainly in China, women still say, you know, we'd like to have 2 children or 3 children, we just can't. It's just not possible given the lives we're expected to lead. We've given women access to education and careers, but they're still asked to do the bulk of child and home care. And they're starting to reject that very explicitly. In Korea, they have a movement, the 4 Bs. B meaning no. The word for no in Korean starts with B, so the 4 Bs, so the 4 no's. No relationships, no marriage, no sex, no children. And that's their platform for improving women's lives. Now, that's tragic that women have to look at those choices because entering marriage saddles them with such severe expectations for being devoted to home and family that they feel they can't live the life they want to live. So if women have to choose between a rewarding career and the demands of having 2 or more children, most women are now choosing the first. And in fact, this is a really startling statistic. For women under age 34, the most common number of children today in the United Kingdom and the United States is 0. That is, more women by age 34 have no children than have either 1 or have 2. It's about 34% have 0, about 30% have 1, about 25% have 2, 5 or 6% have 3 or more. But 0 is now the most common choice for women under 34. That's really startling. Now, in high fertility countries, many women say they would like to have fewer children. But they're subject to very strong pressures from their family. And in some cases, they're pressured to have many children because they think it gives the family more opportunities and a larger eventual kin network to provide support. But education and work does empower women to be economic contributors, and we find that that does make them feel and are regarded by their families as important in ways that make it possible for them to keep a sense of value, even having fewer children. So I'm not a feminist, or at least I've never been a feminist, but even as a sociologist and anthropologist observing what's happening in the world today, I have to say, empowering and improving the lives of women is the key to more balanced fertility in both high fertility and low fertility countries. In the rich world, we need a new family-friendly framework to allow men and women to prioritize family without losing out in their careers. Right now, most corporations expect men to be available to travel, to work weekends, to work late nights. That's not family-friendly. Worse yet, women who take similar jobs and careers are expected to compete with men by doing the same things. That's even less family-friendly, and it's not really fair to either men or women because it means nobody really has a choice to combine career with devotion to your kids. Whether it's men or women choosing to take parental leave or not, as long as companies basically say, kids are your problem, they're a distraction, we want you to work as hard as possible, and then maybe by the time you get to your early 30s, you'll get tenure or promotion or partnership. That's extremely hostile. And for the non-professional, non-career people, Jobs are getting more difficult in terms of having the salary to support a family. At the blue-collar level, globalization has resulted in the salaries for blue-collar jobs falling in relative terms. In order to have a middle-class income now, you need 2 earners in working-class jobs. And that, again, makes it very difficult to properly raise a family. Now, in the developing world, we need better support for educating and employing women. Smaller families will allow women and young people to be more productive. And it's not like this is not recognized. Ivanka Trump, in President Trump's first term, created a new subdivision in USAID that was called Empowering Women in Developing Countries. It had precisely the goal of improving education, entrepreneurship, access to credit, access to jobs for women in low-income, high-fertility countries. It was a good program. It's now disappearing along with the rest of USAID. And the question really is, okay, is fertility in Africa their problem, or is it our problem? And in a sense, all women in the world have the same problem, and that is dealing with a patriarchy that prevents them from being both parents and reaching their maximum productive potential. Now, a lot of women want to be full-time moms, and I think that's great. One of the other problems we have is that women who want to be full-time moms are often criticized and marginalized and being told, you know, you're letting down women by accepting a traditional role. Well, if women want to do that, I think that's okay. At the same time, I think this traditional wives movement that tries to rope all women back into a kind of you should prioritize family and children first, that's not going to work. Women in general have been fighting against that for decades now, so there's no point trying to drag people into something backward. Plus, the traditional wife model had all kinds of problems, including spousal abuse, marital rape, all kinds of terrible things. I don't think we want to go back there. So while it's perfectly fine if some women want to prioritize children, we don't live in a world where it's really okay for men to prioritize family above work. Men who do that are often seen as less desirable spouses by successful women, because we still have this kind of rigid ideas that men should be the primary earner, and if they're not, then something is wrong with the relationship or something is wrong with the man. He's not working hard enough, he's not ambitious enough, and all of that is leading to a terrible insecurity among men. People talk about a crisis of masculinity. Men are still doing fine. They still make more money than women for the same jobs and so on. But there's a crisis of masculinity because men feel pressured to be in a position that no longer fits in a world where most women are also getting educated, and frankly, more women are capable than many men. And unless we accept that and say, okay, let's build our world around the recognition that men and women both can have successful roles in a career, both are important in raising a family, and we need to work these things out. If we don't do that, we make life very hard for men and women both. So, bottom line is don't try and tell people what to do. Don't bribe or coerce them in regard to fertility goals. Help them have the families that they want. Right now, we're not doing that anywhere in the world. Women in the rich world are almost all having far fewer children than they say they would like, and it's leading to the gradual extinction of humanity. I even say that patriarchy is killing humanity. It's not because I'm some kind of, radical feminist champion. It's just what the data shows. At the same time, in areas with high fertility, it's hard to let those societies reach their maximum potential unless the number of children drops to around 3 children per family or less. That's the point at which you get larger investment, more cumulative education, and higher productivity for young people. So again, don't tell people what to do. Don't try and bribe or coerce them. Let's create social relations and family relations that let people have the number of children they want. It sounds simple. We're not doing it anywhere in the world, and it's damaging our future. All right, thank you. I will say, it'll take time, all right? I don't expect that bang, tomorrow we're going to have a blissful world of wonderful social relations. So in the short term, we do need other options. It would be nice to have better integration of high and low fertility regions. It would be better to facilitate migration in a peaceful, orderly way to benefit everyone. And in particular, I think cooperation with Africa will be key. There's a tendency to see Africa as an area of problems and somehow wall it off, separate it. We don't want to deal with that. But Africa's got the greatest growth potential in the world right now. Almost 98% of the growth in the young labor force in the next 40 years in the entire world is going to be in Africa. If those young people are productive, it helps the whole world economy move forward. If they grow up unproductive and mired in conflict, it will drag the whole world economy down. Now, if you do some estimates, potential for African growth is very high. There are already large modern cities arising. There are artificial intelligence centers in Ghana. There are solar energy farms growing up. The potential demographic dividend is anywhere from $20 trillion to $45 trillion. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. At 7% growth a year, Africa's economy could grow by $45 trillion in the next 40 years. And it's not crazy. 9 African countries this year actually did have growth over 6%. But Africa needs a facilitator. Somebody has to be able to provide a base for investment to go in and for profits to come out. For China, Hong Kong was a tremendous benefit. That is, Hong Kong provided Western-style accounting, finance, banking, rule of law, and so money could go into Hong Kong. The Hong Kong institutions that knew China could invest in industries there, and they could help manage that growth. Africa needs something like that. And a center of political stability and financial security that has adjacency and good knowledge with Africa, that's actually a wonderful rule for the Emirates. Mauritius, maybe. Morocco, maybe. But all of these countries that have already started, I mean, I was telling, the UAE is not the only country in the world that's had a lot of oil and gas, right? Nigeria, Angola, other countries. But what the UAE has done with its mineral wealth is incredible, right? You've kind of created another Hong Kong, Singapore here on the Gulf in just decades, whereas African countries have struggled for a century. So using the lessons here and using the stability and financial resources here could be great. So, rules for a happier future. Improve the lives of women, invest in Africa, increase cooperation and integration among regions with different demographic conditions, and the UAE is actually ideally placed to be a broker and lead in all of these efforts, whether it's progress in women's rights in the Arab world, progress in the economy. I applaud what has happened here compared to what's happened in other developing regions. What we really need to do is carry that success into the new frontier when it will be desperately needed. Thank you.